Now I've decided to keep it again. Good morning, Facebook friends, and welcome. We are going to dive into lesson 3, part 2. I know. Laura's just like, I cannot believe this woman. I was just telling them because I've been having this like back and forth with my hair, and everybody knows this. Like, and so for the last couple weeks, I'm like, I'm cutting it off again. I'm just cutting it off. And this week I was like, I don't know, maybe I'll keep it a while. So anyway, it doesn't really matter because nobody can cut hair, so I can just do this whole back and forth thing as long as I want to, right? Yeah. So, but anyway, so I have to tell you guys. I have a couple of announcements. None of them are like earth-shattering. But for my Facebook friends, I'm backwards today, and I know that I am. And you might not even be able to notice until I hold up a piece of paper. But today when I was trying to flip the screen like I always do, every time I flipped it, it was like green. It just wouldn't, and I thought, well, you'd probably rather look at me backwards than green. So that's the way I made that decision. And for local friends, whether you're Zooming or on Facebook, I think I might try to add a gathering at the end of this class if we're permitted to do so, where you guys could come to my house and I could have some bagels and I could hand out the mark books for those of you who want mark books. I don't know that we'll be able to do that by June 9 or whatever that is, right? I think that's June 9. But just maybe think that if not, I can do a drive-by, put the mark books on the front porch and you guys can drive by. And good morning, Lisa. Good morning, Kathy. So for local friends who want mark books, maybe the week after, like during the class period, either if we're allowed to come in and visit for a while, we could do that. If not, we could kind of do some drive-by mark books out on my front porch or something. So anyway, I'm going to try to make those available to you. So.
Well, are you going to set bagels out on the front porch?
Oh, sure, yeah, I'll put the bagels on the front porch, yeah.
I want cream cheese too.
What?
I want cream cheese.
Oh, you want cream cheese too? Okay, I'll try to make sure I have like the big setup. I'll put a table out in the front yard. I just might do that. So I would do that like the week, this time frame after we're done, the week after. So we'll just kind of put that as a question mark and we'll see how things unfold if that's all right. So yeah, I wanted to make that announcement and talk about the fact that I was flipped, and I think that's it, maybe. So let's pray. And I loved this lesson. I just learned so much. I got a lot. Good morning, Joyce Heller. I gained a lot. I just loved this lesson. So I'm excited about discussing it with you guys, see what you all learned too. So let's pray this morning. Holy Father, we come before you this morning just with hearts and minds open to receive what you have for us, Lord. I'm looking forward to learning what others have received as they've studied this week, God. And I just lift our discussion to you, Lord. I just offer it to you, dedicate it to you, and ask, Lord, that you really just help us to feel your presence this morning, because we know that it is among us. And we pray, Lord, that you can just grow us in our relationship with you, and just grow us in connection with you, and help us to want to do the things that we need to do in order to live our lives as a greater reflection of your example, Lord. So again, we just thank you for this time, Lord, and we lift all this in your name. Amen. All right, so let's dive in a little bit. Let's fill in our at a glance. Moving forward first. I like to do that. So good morning, Kathy. I like to do that so I don't forget, because sometimes I forget. So the at a glance that I'm using is from lesson 2, part 2, and it's on page 141. And again, it's going to be backwards today, but it's just like that, right? It is backwards, right? Yes. And so chapter 4, anybody want to shout out what you wrote as a chapter theme for chapter 4? We're going to just do 4 and 5 since those are the chapters. We're going to do those together on the at a glance so we don't forget. Anybody have a chapter 4 theme? Are we in chapter 4? I'm in the right lesson, right? I'm just kidding. Nobody's answering. So I wrote, Lisa's typing. I know Lisa's like, just tell us the answer. No, I wrote, Cain kills Abel / he and his descendants turn from God. Cain kills Abel / he and his descendants turn from God. There is an option in Zoom for a white screen, which you can like write on it as you go. I need to like play with that and because then I could share it and then I could write these things down a little bit more. But for today, so Cain kills Abel. He and his descendants turn from God. And then chapter 5, I just wrote generations of Adam. And so now that you have what I wrote down, anybody have something better, different, something you wanted to add to those? Generations of Adam or chapter 4, Cain kills Abel / he and his descendants turn from God. Anything I missed?
How about pride strikes again?
Pride strikes again. Yes. Yeah. That's so true. And that just goes to, we talk about this usually when we start a class, but that is like the where I usually go to the more literal, this is the event that happened, right? I think there's a wealth or a richness when you will go to the different place. Remember we talk about that sometimes and kind of do the lesson that's in there. And I think that points to a chapter theme that's really more about the lesson that's in there. Because it's pride in the comparison. The whole thing about the offering, when we get to that today, I love that, and not because I love it, but it's just such rich teaching for us as we learn about the difference between offering and the heart behind the offering, right? But it's about pride in terms of being offended that God didn't receive his offering when we get there. But it's also a pride in that an unwillingness to confess it. Right? I'll just forget you then, right? Oh gosh, it's so many good lessons in there. Not good, but again, good. So, anything else with the at a glance then before we get into we're going to go right into chapter 4 today, I think. We can do just a quick review. Genesis, because we've camped in chapters 1, 2, and 3 for so long already, but Genesis 1 is the God created heaven and earth, and the Genesis 2 is sort of the details behind that story, right? More especially with the creation of Adam and Eve, of mankind, right? And then chapter 3 is the fall, right? The deception and the turning away. And then ultimately the separation, which I think as we look a little bit deeper today, we will see that even though Adam and Eve were separated by God, or from God, they didn't fall out of relationship with God. Some of their children walked with God moving forward, and some of their children did not. But there's a stark difference between their confessing what they had done to God and Cain's inability, or not inability because he was able, but his unwillingness to confess what he'd done before God and acknowledge it. And that goes back to, we've talked so often about David. I'm in the Psalms right now with our church on Wednesday nights, and I'm learning so much just about David and David's heart. And David was a man after God's own heart, not because he didn't mess up, right? But because of his willingness to call on God, to be honest with God, to confess when he was confronted with his sinful nature, to mourn his sinful nature. I'm in Psalm 6 this week that I've been studying, and it just talks about how he recognizes that his sin brings misery into his life, and so that is what makes us men or women after God's own heart, is our decision not to do what we'll see that Cain does, where he just basically was like, it was my choice, I did it, I don't answer to you, so. All right, so let's just kind of jump into chapter 4, and let's start on page 36 in our homework, and we're going to look at a little bit of a study that we did just on verse 1. If we look at 36, and it's number 1, A and B, and we talked about this idea that Eve called her son a man-child. Remember studying that this week? Page 36, day 2, 1a. What does Eve say when Cain is born? What does it say in the scripture that Eve says?
She's gotten a man-child.
Yes. Right. I have gotten. Yes, I have gotten a man-child with the help of the Lord. And in B, it said, remembering what God had said in Genesis 3:15, and let's remind ourselves, what did God say in Genesis 3:15? Let's go back and look at that real quick.
That's the one that you thought was probably the most, the key verse in this whole study. First study anyway. I will put an enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed, and shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel.
And what do we... Go ahead, Barb, sorry.
I think part of what Eva was saying was, this is my person that's going to bruise the heel of the serpent.
Right.
That's my feeling. Anyway, I don't...
Yeah, who in 3:15 now, from where we are, what do we know God is talking about here? Jesus, right? Yeah, Jesus.
She didn't know that.
But she didn't know that, right? And so, what does it seem like? Maybe she is saying, now I've had this child, my seed is born, and so now this is the man child that the Lord has given, right? And
Yes.
I wrote down in that B, and this is true for me, and I want to know what you guys think about it. It's hard for us to see a bigger plan. We often anticipate things to happen faster or more literally, right? That's what I
have been saying since Eve.
Yes, right, yeah. And so, and I don't think that because for Eve, I think there is this idea, I have waited a long time, and this may be your plan coming to fruition in my life. And I think about times maybe that we do that when we feel like we've waited a long time for something, or when, and I want to know what you guys think about this, when we have an idea of what God's promise means in our life, and so when we see something or we experience something, we want to sort of force our ideas into his, how am I trying to say it? We want to make it work, what we want or what we see as fruition into what his promise is. Does that make sense at all? Yeah, I'll let
I
you
think
guys.
a lot of it all goes back to we want it to happen yesterday.
Sometimes it's just our impatience, right? Yes. Yeah. And I think it's just, what am I trying to say? I'm trying to think about, I always hesitate to talk about my car accident because I have been told I talk about it too much, so forgive me. But I learned so much through it that I think it's worth talking about. But so in June is the 10th year, or it's been 10 years since our auto accident. And it's really interesting how, like, if you'd have asked me in year 2, right, I would have said, God has taught me so much. And I've learned the lessons from the accident that God had brought into my life. And then if I would have said, or I did, and I would say in year 4, I've learned so much more than I had in year 2. And God has really brought that, right? And here I am in year 10, and I look back over the last 10 years. I couldn't begin to talk to you in any kind of condensed time frame of all the things that God has taught me from that incident. But if I had, I would have thought in year 2 that God had taught me the lessons that he was going to teach me. Does that make sense at all? Like, and sometimes there's this unfolding that as we continue to lean into God, he continues to like refine us, even sometimes through the same situation. And it doesn't negate what I had learned in the first 2 years, because it goes back to that intentional creation, and we keep talking about that bar creator, right? Because those first 2 years of learning, and I'm just picking up random time frames, it could be 6 months, whatever, in that first section of learning or whatever, built the foundation so that I could learn the next thing, which builds the foundation. It's not all because of the accident, but that was just such an important, significant event in my spiritual journey, that I can just see how God used that one thing to sort of catapult me into kind of a whole different place in my life. And so I think we do sometimes say, I think this is God's work, and God's work maybe is complete, when in the reality is God's just getting started on our hearts, right, in a certain situation. So I don't know. Any thoughts about that from anybody?
Only that I agree.
Yes. Okay. Well, I'll take it. That's fine. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I do, and as I wait for things that I want in my life, there's a lot of times I have to go back and think about Joseph.
Yeah.
Joseph always the first one came to mind.
Yes.
Comes to mind.
Yes. and you think about like the same kind of situation. Joseph's sold into slavery, and that is such a significant event in his life. That's the Joseph you're talking about, right, Joyce? Yeah. Okay, just checking. Yeah, this is such a significant, and when he, I would think like when he was like first leaning into God's blessings, and then he got put into jail, and so there's this long process of it. There was a lot that happened, but God was there all along the way. But every time you might think, well, this is what God used that for, or then you would think this is what God used that for. Well, God continues to use things in our life for greater and greater purposes as long as we continue to lean into Him and receive the teaching that He has for us. So I guess I just say that because I totally get why Eve would be like, oh, this is it. This is what He meant. And in some sense it is, but not fully, right? Because there's more to come. So okay, so then in verse 2, Eve gives birth to another son, Abel. And what's the difference in their occupations? Verse 2.
One's a farmer and one's a servant.
Right. Abel is a keeper of flocks, and Cain is a tiller or worker of the ground. And then we have this offering situation that happens right away, right? This is the accident, right? This is the thing that happens. This is like a significant event. And somebody talked to me about like verses 3 and 4 there about the offerings. What's the difference? And you can look on page 37. There's a chart in your homework on page 37 that kind of we divide. We laid this out a little bit. What was Cain's offering?
Something that he'd grown from the ground.
Right. He was a farmer, and he brought, what does it say specifically? I'm asking
Fruit
myself.
of the ground.
Fruit of the ground.
Fruit of
Right.
the ground.
Yes. Abel brought what?
The firstborn of his flock.
Yes.
And the fat portions.
And the fat portions. I have a little note on fat portions if you're interested. I found this. The Message calls the fat portions the choice cuts of meat, which I thought that was kind of interesting. And I read, probably in a commentary, but I didn't write down where, fat that covered the entrails of the animals. Later, Jews were forbidden to eat this fat, which was reserved as an offering to God, especially for sin. So this fat portions is kind of like the choicest offering. Okay, which just helps me understand a little bit more. Without like even studying it or looking at anything our homework taught us, what do you see about the difference between 3 and 4? What do we see the difference of the offering, even when we don't dig very deep?
To me, I'm not sure this is where but to me, knowing what we now know, what jumped out was that it says that Cain brought an offering, which was, to me, just, it was like it was generic. It was just an offering.
Yes.
And that in Abel, it specifies that he brought the firstlings of his flock.
I think that's a very important distinction, that it indicates that he brought the firstlings of his flock and of their fat portions. Yeah. Absolutely. And so then what happens next? What was God's response to the offering? Because I think, here's the thing. I think, and for years, this has really confused me. This isn't the first time that I studied it deeper and had kind of a little bit better understanding of it. But I will say, for a long time, I'm like, I don't understand why one is better than the other. Okay, yeah. Why is one better than the other?
Yeah.
And so, what is God's response? Because we learn really quickly after this that one of them for God is better than the other, right? And so, what does God say?
He had regard for Abel.
Right. Yes. The Lord had regard.
He had no regard.
Right. Yeah. Verse 4, he had regard for Abel and his offering. Verse 5, but for Cain and for his offering, he had no regard. Right? So Cain became... Go ahead.
I had a question.
Yeah.
Do you think that the vegetables, I think about them being beautifully arrayed, by the way. But do you think the problem was because the original curse was that the ground would be cursed?
I think
Did you
that.
ever think about that?
No, I have never thought about that. I think that's interesting. Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think for me in all of this, as we continue to dig a little bit deeper, it's the heart behind the offering. I mean, and I think we know that, right? That's what God is able to see is the heart behind the offering, and it makes me wonder if Cain had given his all in that plot of land, whatever he was farming, right? And had taken the very best of the first fruits, because there's a whole festival of first fruits. I mean, the people moving forward, the people are to dedicate their first fruits from the ground, right, to the Lord. And if he had dedicated the very best of his first fruits and taken those and humbly laid them before the Lord, my feeling is this story would be very different, right? That God would acknowledge the different offerings because of the heart that brought it. There's also oh, go ahead, Alice. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, and then, because I've always struggled with this particular verse, but, also with the animal, it was sacrificed because they threw in, the fat.
The fat, yes.
So it wasn't a live animal. That meant that he was not going to get that replaced. So it definitely was an offering.
Yes. There's something more sacrificial about there's a bigger loss when you give up an animal like that, maybe. But I do think, I don't think you think about the widow's mite. Is that the name of the parable that's in the Gospels, right? Where it talks about, it's not about an equal offering, because the man who, you guys know the story I'm talking about, when the man drops in all the money and the disciples are watching, and the widow drops in maybe a coin or two. And Jesus asked them who gave the most, and they were like, well, and it was several people, I think, were dropping in more, right? And they're like, well, we don't know for sure, and stuff. And Jesus points out, well, the widow gave the most. Well, and so we know that the most isn't about worldly most, right? It's about the heart behind who gives the offering. And I think that's the main thing here. So for me, I think to answer your question with a question, I think there is a little bit of mystery to me. Would a fruit, a vegetable, an agricultural offering ever have been as good an offering as an animal? I don't know the answer to that. I do know the reason.
You have to think about his life was a farmer.
Yes.
I mean, he was the tiller of the ground.
Yes.
That's what he had.
I do know that the reason, right, that he had no regard was because of the heart that, and it matters too. Are you a farmer that has access to animals, but you don't want to give that offering? Or are you a farmer that actually doesn't have access to animals? Because the Lord knows what we have access to, which is why the widow's offering was deemed to be the greatest all day long, right? Because the Lord knew that she is getting her offering she's offering the best that she has. And so it really comes down to, are we offering the best that we have? And, I think as we think about offerings, often we think of money, right? But a lot of people can give an offering of something that might be more significant in terms of how it helps the church budget or how it furthers a mission. But it may not be an offering to the Lord if it's not something that costs us something, or it creates a sacrifice on our behalf, which doesn't mean we wouldn't be praised by the mission or by the church for offering it, right? But is our offering pleasing and sacrificial to the Lord? And I would suggest that that's true about our offering of money, and it's also true about our offering of time, because that is one of our greatest resources always. My friend Shannon, that I'm in that book study with right now, who's written that book called Comparison Girl, I know I've been talking about it a lot recently. We talked last week about comparing our wealth, was this chapter that we were working on, and she shared a story of a woman who was quite affluent that wrote what she thought was a $5,000 check to a mission, which was a nice gift. But she got a phone call from one of the higher ups, maybe the president of the mission or something, just thanking her for her generosity and telling her all the things that would do for their mission. And she was surprised, because she's like, $5,000, that's a nice sum, but I didn't know that it warranted that. And come to find out, either she or her person that did it, whatever, had written a check for $50,000. Which was quite a different gift than the $5,000. And so this woman had this sort of, what do I do? Because I meant to give $5,000 and I just gave a lot more than $5,000, you know. But she decided to give the gift, to leave the gift with the mission and let them do with that work. But that, you know, that calls into question, like I think there was a part about comparison. But for us this morning, there's this question of 5,000 was something she was like, I don't know that was that big a deal. But 50,000 made her pause, right? Now for somebody else, 5,000 would make them pause, or 500 would make them pause. But there's this like, what kind of heart is offering this? And I think in that situation, it's a beautiful illustration of God kind of calling her, not calling her out, but like inviting her actually to offer something to him for his work that actually cost her something, right? It was a sacrificial gift. I don't know. What do you guys think? I think we get pretty comfortable in our giving. What, Joyce Heller?
Maybe that's the whole point right there. It was a sacrificial gift.
Yeah, yeah. And
something you had to sacrifice.
Right.
So your heart was more toward God than toward you.
Yes, yes.
Which is what he wants to begin with.
Yeah, and I think we can we can look at the difference between the grain offering or the agriculture offering and the animal offering, and there are differences there, but ultimately I believe the point behind the story and the point behind the regard for this offering and not for this offering is I understand the heart that brought the offering, and I have regard for the heart of humility and sacrifice, and I do not have regard, as Alice said in this chapter, the prideful heart that attempts to check the box of offering but doesn't connect the heart of offering. So there was an enduring word, or I had a couple of things that I looked at from this chapter in the enduring word that I wanted to share with you guys. And one said, enduring word is the commentary app that I use a lot. Cain's offering was the effort of dead religion, while Abel's offering was made in faith, in a desire to worship God in spirit and in truth, was what one commentator said. Cain, go ahead, Laura. Yeah.
I confess that I did not dig deep in this chapter as far as consulting a lot of different commentaries and sources, but I thought it was just interesting that I wondered what prompted Cain to even make an offering.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we won't know. I mean, we don't know when that whole idea
right
became a practice, I guess, you know. But I just wonder what prompted or spurred him to even do that.
Well, let's think on that just a second. What are some of the reasons we drop money into the offering plate when we gather for church and the offering plate comes by? What are some of the different reasons that we do that?
Because you're supposed to give 10%.
Okay.
I mean, the first 10% is supposed to belong to God, so you should give that freely. It's my thinking. And then I've heard it said before let me think. That is a tithe, and anything above that is an offering.
Okay. Yeah. You've heard that too, Laura, that 10% is a tithe and anything above that is an offering. Yeah. So, and here's the question. Go ahead, Joyce.
I take that to mean that the true gift is the over. I take it to mean that the true gift is the offering. That the 10% is just what belongs to God, what you're supposed to give. But that doesn't take much. It does for some. It would for some. But for me, it technically doesn't. You know. So.
Right. Yeah.
Well, the point was that it's the first time that offering, the idea
Go ahead.
of offering, and you know, we haven't thus far in Genesis. There hasn't been anything mentioned about worshiping or praising, you know, praising God or I mean, it's just kind of comes out of the blue, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, the commandments, if you will, at this point are fairly minimal, right? Take care of the earth and be fruitful and multiply. Like, I can't, that's kind of their, like, just, that's kind of what they're supposed to do in order to honor him right now, right? And don't eat this one tree. So, whoops. I guess 2 out of 3 aren't bad. It's just those, there's just so many. Love God, love others, there's just so many, right? Go ahead, Joyce Wisely. I can see you're going to say something else.
I moved to a different room. My internet connection is just lousy.
Oh, I'm sorry.
But this part of the scripture has always bothered me, and I think it's because he didn't give me enough information.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I mean, I never understood what the difference was.
Yeah.
And the only thing I could come up with and got out of this study is one was a willing heart, one was not.
That's right.
Yeah,
You know,
that's right.
but you don't know what the relationship was between the brothers.
Right.
You know, you don't know
Mm-hmm.
what made Cain's attitude be what it was.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, and I've always felt like I would like to know more.
Yes.
You know, about it, and but it really comes down to it can't be anything but a willing heart.
Right, and that goes, I think you're right, that it can't be anything other than that because of what we know about God's character.
Right.
Right? Because I know this, I think we know this. If 2 people brought different offerings from a place of love and humility and sacrifice, I don't think there's not a doubt in my mind that God doesn't honor both. Because our offerings, what we offer the world, are quite different, and something that costs me a great deal doesn't cost somebody else something, you know? And so I think that we know that the issue between God and Cain's offering was never about the offering, it was about the heart that brought the offering. And we see that played out as we're going to go to these next few verses about Cain's unwillingness to confess and repent and turn back and even just honor God, or he just lies to God here as we get to these next couple of verses. Let's look at just to do a little bit deeper on page 38 when we looked at Hebrews 11 1-7, and we marked faith and we looked up the word for faith. What did we learn? 38 number 3, about halfway down. What did we learn from Hebrews 11:2 about faith?
I wrote down, we trust that the universe was formed at God's command. It originated from God, not from something that already existed.
Mm-hmm.
Is that what you said? Number 3, right?
Yeah, 3 from 11 Hebrews 11:2.
I had by faith men of old gained approval.
Gained approval. Me too.
Yeah. I think all of that is true. Yes, I did also. I focused on the approval part. We are approved through faith. And I think that if Cain is not approved, then it leads us to understand that God could see that was not a heart that was faithful. He did not bring that offering in faith. All right? He might have dropped it in the offering plate as it passed by, but he did it out of obligation, or he did it out of, I don't know his brain, but he did it out of, though he was motivated by something other than a faith relationship with God.
Did you notice up in number 1, up there where it said look up the Greek word?
Uh-huh.
I ended up going to trust, and that was loyalty to a person or fidelity to a promise. And so that is the disregard for God.
Mm-hmm. Yes. What else did you get? I like going there next. What else did you get under that number 1 as we looked up faith, the Greek word of faith?
The Greek word for faith and belief are the same. I found that interesting also.
Okay.
And P-I-S-T-I-S. And that it was, it's always a gift from God, not something produced by people.
Uh-huh.
I found that heartwarming, I guess.
Uh-huh. one of the things I pulled out from, I wrote down to rely by inward certainty, which kind of goes back, I think, to what Alice was just saying about the fidelity, right? To rely by inward certainty. I think there's sometimes faith can be, I was just listening, I'm finishing up a book by Beth Moore called Chasing Vines. So good, guys. But I was listening to part of that this morning as I was getting ready for the day. And she was talking about how sometimes we're going to look foolish in our faithful decisions, right? But when we have an inward certainty, that is what we can stand strong on. And then when we feel like we are looking foolish, or because there's always the possibility in our faith we'll look foolish, we can stand on that. We can have this like fidelity, I like that word, in a promise that we believe in. And then we don't have to even defend it, right? We don't have to even, what's the word? We don't have to even be threatened by the fact that we look foolish. Does that make sense, right? Like we don't even have to worry about that. We just know this is who God is. I have faith in that. I'm learning more about it all the time, but I walk confidently in my belief. What else on that? Anything else on 38 there about the Hebrew stuff that you guys thought was? How about 5 at the bottom? What does this imply with respect to Cain's offering and what you saw in Genesis 4? This, I don't know what this is at that point. It
was, the offering was made by faith by Abel, but probably by self-pride by Cain.
Yeah, I think I wrote down God judged the heart of the worshiper. And I think that's a really important distinction to make, because we can look at that and think this is like a harsh God, that if you don't bring the right thing, if you don't do the right thing, he's going to be mad at you, right? He's going to call you out on it and say that's not a good offering. And we have this false idea that we can bring the wrong kind of offering and then be on God's wrong side. But again, we got to take our eyes off of the literal, like the offering is not the issue, right? The issue for God is always the heart of the worshiper. What did he say, for those of you who did Jeremiah with us some time ago? What does he say? I think it was in Jeremiah, where he's like, I don't want your offering. I don't want your sacrifices. I don't want you at the festivals and pretending when it's not about me, because the next day you're off here worshiping something else, right? It's not about that. I want your heart. And if I don't have your heart, then don't drop your stuff in the offering plate. It doesn't matter to me. I'm going to get my work done with or without your money, right? It's about the heart that gives the money. That's what I want. And I'll put your money to good use. I'll use it for good things, but I don't need it, right? I need your heart, because the heart that drops in the money in a faithful attitude is the same heart that will follow me when I call you. It's the same heart that will give your time and your service and your gifts. It's the same heart that will sit quietly with me and hear my correction and conviction, right? That's the heart that I want. Dropping it in the offering plate is an extension of what you already know of me. It doesn't get you to me, right? It doesn't make me pleased with you. And I think that's a big distinction that we need to really own and be honest about. So, okay, so then let's go back to this. Turn in your book, if you want to page 40. We're going to use this chart under day 3 right there just a little bit. But what is this exchange between Cain and God? Once this happens and his countenance fell, right? Verse 5. So Cain became, this is important, so Cain became very angry and his countenance fell. And I looked countenance up just because I'm like, I know what that means, but what does that mean? Did you too? Yeah, okay. So, because I'm like, I know, because I'm like, I know what that means, but what does it mean, And so it's like face, and I wrote down from turn toward or away from, to make a turn. When his countenance fell, you guys remember that from like Old Testament stuff? We talked about turn away, turn towards, when we turn away from the wrong thing, turn towards. So he had turned away from God and towards something else. And it was an expression or attitude. I think about sometimes when I'm mad at my husband. I mean, so rarely this happens, but every once in a while, and he just knows now is not a good time to talk to her, right? I don't have to say anything. It's just obvious, right? In my countenance. I'm just being honest. It's me too with Lisa said that she had to She had to look up countenance also. It's just obvious in my countenance that I do not want to continue to discuss whatever it is we've been discussing, or I don't want to hear it, right? And as just the same way that I can sort of, I don't want to hear it. And think about that in Cain's attitude with God in this, where he's just like, listen, I don't want to hear it. His countenance had fallen, which, if you think about my face with Matt, it's probably easier to understand that if you just read, he was very angry and his countenance fell. Go ahead, Joyce.
I'm thinking how lucky you are to have a husband who recognizes
Perhaps my countenance has greatly fallen.
Mine doesn't get it a lot of time.
Mine does. Sometimes he just leaves. And then I'm like, oh, fine, you're not going to talk to me? He's like, yeah, no, I'm not. You're right. Oh, Lord. Okay, so let's see. Verse 6. Okay, verse 6 is so curious, too, because then we start with the questions, right? What does God ask?
Why are you angry?
Why are you angry?
Why is God asking that? Why does God ask, why are you angry?
Certainly not because he needs to know.
Exactly. It's not because God needs to know. This is not a mutual relationship. Like my husband in that situation might say, why are you angry? Right? Like probably wouldn't, but he could, because he wouldn't know why I'm angry. Okay? I'm angry because you said you were going to do something and you didn't 2 days ago and you're just now figuring it out. Like that might be the truth in our relationship, right? That Matt's like, I don't even know what I've done. That's not why God's asking, right? Why is he asking then?
Don't you think it's to give him a second chance? He could have said what he did and changed the whole thing.
Right.
But he did.
And I always go to this, it's kind of my go-to, but you think about David and Bathsheba and his lament in Psalm 51, right? When he recognizes what he's done, he turns his heart back to the Lord, right? A chance to confess. Yes, Lisa, absolutely. And so he gives him this chance to confess, and then he also gives a warning. What's the warning in verse 7?
That's a neat warning.
Uh-huh.
Sin is crouching.
Uh-huh.
Which to me means he's ready to pounce. All you have to do is just...
Yeah. And what makes the sin crouching? What is it that makes Cain? God is warning Cain about his vulnerability, don't you think? You are vulnerable.
It's a loving confrontation when you
It really is. I may have had, I cannot, I go back to this, God,
automatic affirmation.
God cannot dwell in a heart that rejects him.
Yes.
But that doesn't mean he doesn't continue to try to call the heart that rejects him. So he's like, listen, I can't take your offering because that didn't come from a place. That didn't really have anything to do with me. That has to do with you and you trying to, again, this is me making some things up, but this is about you trying to do something to be right with me, and it doesn't work like that. So I don't take your offering. But I do still call you into relationship with me, and I'm going to confront you right now and say, what's this anger about? Because this anger between you and me, it makes you vulnerable for temptation. And you think about that in our own lives. When are we vulnerable? And we talked about temptation last week, and I've thought about this a lot, how that word for tempt means pierce. Like it's trying to get into something a little bit deeper, right, than something that's already there. Something is already there with Cain. And like Joyce was saying, Joyce Wisely, who knows what the story between Cain and Abel has been for whatever years it's been? Who knows the difference between Cain and his parents and Abel and his parents? Or what? Something has led to this, right? Where now I'm going to direct my anger about the fact that I'm not even right before God at you, and I'm not going to look internally. There's something probably else that's going on that we just can't know because it's not written down. But what is it that makes us vulnerable in this place that God is warning not just Cain but all of us about? Sin is crouching at your door, right? I'll go back to what Alice said at the very beginning. Your pride is setting you up for a fall, right? Because you will not humble yourself before me, and we can't talk about how this went or what happened. This is just the beginning of how this is going to snowball, in your life. Go ahead.
I thought about,
Yeah.
To me, I was thinking about Cain, and this was what made this rich for me this week, was this, this is just one of those childhood stories that you read, and I just have never really gone back and read as an adult and pondered on it.
Yep.
But, now I lost my train of thought.
It'll come back.
Cain was defensive. You know,
Yes.
he was bristly and defensive and took it so personally.
Yep.
And I don't know. My mind wandered off into thinking about how can I think about this a lot about how can two kids from the same parents turn out so differently.
Yeah.
You know,
Not true.
We have that in our family.
Yeah.
You know, we have,
That's why I only had one.
Yeah. They had nothing to compare it to. Well, what you're saying about his defensiveness reminds me of something that happened with me and my friend Maria years ago, and I was really struggling in a relationship, and she and she just was allowing me to kind of share, and I was upset about the relationship. This will make me cry, because Maria makes me cry. We should all have friends that are kind of like better than us, I think, like in some ways. But so we talked about that for a while, and then she was going to pray with me, and she prayed with me, and the majority of her prayer focused on how my heart might need to soften in order to receive what God was teaching me through this. Like, it was about my heart, and I'm like, you're supposed to be praying that this other person, right? Like, whatever. We're here to talk about what this other person has done to me and how I'm struggling with it and how victimized I am or whatever. And her whole prayer was about my heart being tender so that the Lord could teach me and so that I could see and all this. And I tell you what, my first reaction, I just confessed it, was like, what? This is not what we're supposed to be. It was just like Cain, or he was just like, who am I? Am I my brother's keeper today? Kind of thing, whatever. That was probably 5-6 years ago. It's still very fresh in my memory because that's exactly what needed to happen. And she knew that, and she lovingly called me, God lovingly called me to correction through her words, right? So, yeah. So I get it. I've been Cain. Go ahead, Mary Ellen. Yeah.
Do you think that Cain was so angry because this just came that he was found out? I mean, he knew what he was doing.
Sure.
And thought he was going to get away with it. Oh, well, this offer's good enough.
Yeah, absolutely.
And God said, hey, wait a minute, this is not good enough.
Well, I think so. That's the same.
And that made him even angrier because he didn't get away with it.
That's the same reason, sitting with Maria that day, I was like, wait a second. We're not here to talk about my issues with this or what I can, it's kind of like, and I was a little bit like, first of all, I didn't recognize those things in myself, and I wasn't going there, and it's kind of troubling to me that you see those things. I mean, it's just, it's this really, it was a completely safe place to be able to explore that, but it changed me. It really did, and I think that's the difference. I'm not trying to hold myself up to, that's the difference in someone seeking God and not. Because I do seek God. I do it imperfectly, but I do seek God. And I still think about that because there's still times in relationships or in troubling situations where I am able to more quickly say, what in me is part of the problem here, right? What in me is part of the problem here. Now, does that mean everything that someone else does is fine and it's all, no. But it did really open my heart to the idea that sometimes the relationship or the situation isn't going to change. And the change that needs to happen is in you, in me, right? And so, absolutely. I think that's completely true and possible. Okay, so there's another question then in 9. Where is Abel, your brother? I kind of fast forward to that. And then Cain says, I don't know, right? Yeah. Yeah. And we know this, but I didn't actually say in verse 8, that's when Cain kills Abel. We know that, but we actually didn't. That's what the sin crouching at the door led to, right? I'm so angry at you that actually when I see you, it's interesting. Cain told, when it came about when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel, his brother, and killed him. It's just very straightforward and doesn't have a lot of details, but then he asks about his brother. God asks Cain about his brother. And again, he gets the opportunity to confess. He could have confessed earlier. And probably
he can confess now.
And he can confess now, even though the damage continues to get greater. The separation between him and God is even greater now at this point, I think. not between God and his person, but between Cain. Cain is walking farther away from God, right? But still, he says, where is your brother? And gives him an opportunity to, think about the difference in so many of the stories in our lives that we know and in the Bible stories. If at any point the person would humble themselves, fall on their face, literally or metaphorically, right? And say, I have completely messed this up, and I am sorry, and I need your help, and I need your forgiveness, right? It changes every story that isn't playing out like that. Think about that in our own lives. If we had done that, if somebody else had done that, and how the story changes. My dad, in a sermon, I was probably a preteen or a teenager, but I've never forgotten this. There was a pastor. I don't know if my dad knew this person. I can't remember the details of the story, but the pastor and a couple of adults had gone on a youth trip. And on the way home from the youth trip, they had stopped with the kids at a Hooters restaurant, okay? And they had, like, dinner on the way home or whatever at Hooters. And it got to be a big deal in this in that church and in the temple. They're like, why are you taking the kids to Hooters? This is not good, right? And I have no idea what possessed these people to do this, right? This is just like bad show all around. Bad show, Joyce, that's my Disney. But it's just bad show. That's a Disney thing. And but what happened was the adults got really defensive and tried to justify in all these, well, it was the food or whatever, all the things that we say when we shouldn't do something, justify, or she did it or he did it or what, I don't know, there was nowhere else to eat. I mean, just all these things, right? These excuses. And I remember my dad's illustration in the sermon that he was giving that day was the whole thing would go away if he just said, I was wrong and I'm sorry. I shouldn't have done it. We made a bad choice. And we're sorry. Like, it was just wrong. And my dad just, his whole thing on that was like, I think the whole thing then would have gone away. It wouldn't have been the big deal that it had been. There would have been like maybe a little egg on your face. Is that the saying? Like, sometimes when you just made a mistake and you're like, yeah, you have to, but if you just own it and say, I'm sorry, it goes away. Now, this is about murder. It's not about stopping, the ill-advised decision to stop it. But the same concept really applies. When we say we're sorry, it changes. And maybe it doesn't go away. It's not going to bring him back, right? But our heart and the consequences, it stops the work of the enemy. When we confess and we repent and we turn back to God, the enemy's work doesn't keep snowballing in our life. And the lesson there is don't take your kids on a youth trip to Hooters. There you go. You can take that away from class today. My Bible teacher. Yeah, that's all free. So Cain says, verse 13, that his punishment is too much to bear, and God.
I thought that was really good, too.
Yeah. And he's like, no, I can't. This is what you're saying are my consequences are too much, right? And then he's worried about his life, right?
Yeah.
And the Lord says, whoever kills Cain will have something like sevenfold. Is that right? Yeah. Verse 15, sevenfold. Verse 16 is this is one of just those terribly sad verses that Cain went out from the presence of the Lord, right? That's just one of those. It reminds me of Jeremiah, one of the saddest verses. And the refining went on in vain, it says in Jeremiah. The rich young ruler, when he leaves, he turns and leaves the master because he had much and could not let go of it, right? These are the saddest verses, I think, is when people just decide what you're asking I can't do. I can't humble myself and be in relationship with you, and so I will leave you. I had one little interesting note in the Enduring Word about not letting people kill Cain. I don't know exactly how I feel about this, but I thought it was really interesting. It said it was possibly because the population on Earth was precariously low.
Yeah, I read that too.
Did you read that too? Yeah. Mm-hmm. I have mixed feelings about things like that because I'm like, well, God gets his work done any way he wants to, so, but also I see the validation, the validity in that kind of comment as well. So we looked up some cross references on Cain, page 43, number 5. Let's look there real quick. 43, number 5. Yeah, 1 John at the top there. What did we learn about Cain?
It's like it made in New Living it gave reference of Cain belonging to the evil one.
Yeah.
and that we should love one another and not be like Cain.
Right. Be not like Cain. Yeah, I wrote that he was deep in the practice of evil. I'm not sure what version I was looking, but deep in the practice of evil. Yeah. How about from Jude 11? I just wrote down some words, like I wrote down evil, sinful, prideful, unrepentant. Evil, sinful, prideful, unrepentant.
I also wrote rebellion.
Yes. Well, and you think about that in James where it talks about evil leads to temptation, temptation leads to sin, sin leads to death, right? James 1, 13, 14, 15, something like that. And you think about that progression and think about Cain's progression, right? And that's what God is saying. Sin is crouching at your door. There's a progression for this. This is not going to turn around unless you turn it around, right? Yeah. And I think that's the same warning that we have in James. Turn it around, right? Because it's always ours to be able to turn around. What about on page, let's go back to page 39 in the Hebrews. Did we already do this one? 39D.
What number are you on 39?
39D at the top, the second place there. This goes back to a little bit like what Alice and I were talking about regarding the animal offering.
Yeah. I mean, the first time we saw that probably was in Genesis 3:21, where he killed them.
Killed the animals to cover them, right? Yeah. But it does say in Hebrews.
I also read something. I think in her enduring word that there was forgiveness without the shedding of blood. Something.
There is no.
Right. There is no forgiveness without the shedding of blood.
Yeah,
right.
Blood. Yeah. Every part of the sacrifice system under the still Moses.
Right. It also doesn't say like in this that this was a sin offering, so I don't know that we can make that correct correlation completely.
Yeah, I don't know if
because there were different things. I mean, every time we make an offering, every time we make an offering, it isn't to cover our sins, right? Like we pray to God for different reasons. We offer to God for different reasons, but
I just found it kind of interesting. I didn't really feel as though at that point in creation that the shedding of blood.
But we do notice in like their covering in Genesis 3, right? We talked about that last week or week before that that covering their sin, covering their nakedness, covering their shame, if you will, did cost. Exactly. Did require innocence, and we know now that there is no covering for sin other than Jesus' blood, but we also don't need anything else than to believe in Jesus' blood. That goes back to what we learned in Galatians, right? Like when we have faith, we are free. That's all it takes. Righteousness comes through faith alone, right? Not from something else. Yeah. Then we start in verse 17. Then we start looking at the descendants, right? Of Adam's page 47. There was a chart on Adam's descendants. And Cain goes and settles in the land of Nod, it tells us, where he builds a city and names it after his son Enoch. And then it just points out some different things, like among Cain's descendants were people who dwelt in tents, were people who raised livestock, were people who were musicians, or people who made their living off of metals, bronze and iron. That kind of from 16 to 20, 21, 22, it kind of just lists some people and what they did, right? And then we get to, I had another little...
Oh, I got something else I want to tell you.
Yeah.
It's interesting in 17.
Yes.
In the commentary, I read that the fact that he named this after his son, the city, that was another way of being man-centered, not God-centered.
Okay, yes. Yeah.
It was interesting.
Yeah, we're going to see as we go down through his descendants that there's a real contrast between like his generations and Seth's when we get to that, like the ones who followed God. Not that they all followed God, but there's a different humility before God. Yeah. This is a little bit, not changing the subject just a little bit, but I had this note also from Enduring Word because it was talking about how people learned different there's always kind of this battle between the millions of years and the thousands of years, like in the Bible, like how, you know, how quickly. And I just thought this was interesting because I kind of always struggle with that. Although it doesn't bother me too much because I just believe God did it, and I don't understand how God did it. We talked about this when we were just doing it. I don't understand how God did it. I just believe that he did. And the more I study, the more I just get little glimpses of how true it is that God did this, you know. But I thought this was just an interesting point from Enduring Word about like the development of societies and the development of the world and stuff. And it said there are good reasons to believe God created the earth with an apparent age built into it, even as Adam and Eve and the trees of Eden had apparent age built into them. And I thought, I never thought about it like that. Like maybe he put, like, because he made Adam as an adult. Like some of the trees were already mature, or some of the animals were already mature. Like everything that he didn't start as an infant and then grow. It's right. And so maybe the earth, maybe he created it to almost like be like 1,000,000 years old or something. Like, you know, he put things in there that would have taken that kind of time, that we think would have taken that kind of time. Again, I don't have an agenda here. I just thought, I'd never thought of it like that before. Like he created the world with, what is it they said, with apparent age built into it. I don't know. I just thought that was interesting. Okay, and so then we're going to learn about Lamech, Lamech, right? And he had 2 wives, and in 23, he talks about killing a man for wounding him. Mm-hmm. And there's just like in his little song, or whatever this is, I don't know that it's really a song, but he said to his 2 wives, there's just like arrogance in that.
Yeah. It's like he believed that he could have greater retribution on himself than God did.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then kind of after that little song that he does, then we go back actually and talk about Adam again, right? Adam and Eve. And they have another son named Seth. And then Seth has a son named Enosh. And what does it say in 26? That's kind of an important distinction between, we've just been looking at Cain's descendants, and Cain in verse, was it 16, said he walked away from the presence of the Lord. And then we look at some of his descendants, and we hear this little like arrogant what's the word that I'm looking for? I don't know, song for lack of a better word, statement from Lamech. And then we get back to Adam and Seth instead in 26. What does it say that Seth's family does?
Call upon the name of the Lord.
Right. They begin to call upon the name of the Lord. Which just, I think, is an important distinction that, you know, when you don't study, for me anyway, when you don't study something this slowly, I just miss those things. I mean, I might see they call upon the name of the Lord, but I don't ever think about the fact that, but Cain, though, after this happened, walked away from the presence of the Lord, and now this is contrasting. Seth and his family and some of his descendants are calling upon the name of the Lord. Like, that's a very important distinction that I just sometimes kind of
I read in
miss.
Yeah. Word that a lot of theologians think of this as like the first revival.
Sure.
That it was the first indication of a spiritual resurgence after a clear decline, actually.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But I think, like you, I've read that 26, and until I really dug into what that meant, it was just like, it was a sentence.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah.
It didn't hit home that, oh, they're coming back to the Lord.
Right. Yeah. Or continuing, call upon the name of the Lord, for some of them continuing. Yeah. So. Okay, anything else about 4 before we jump into 5?
I love that chapter.
I did too. I learned a lot during what I was doing this week. So Genesis 5, then, if you see something else you want, we'll circle back. No big deal. Genesis 5 is, it says, this is the book of the generations of Adam. So we're going to focus on the descendants, right? And, and we look at these different men, and we see how long they lived. There's a lot of that, right? This and this and this, and they lived this long, and then they died, right? So Adam was 130 years old when Seth was born. And it says, and this was one thing that I think it pointed out in the homework, that in verse 1 it talked about how Adam was created in the likeness of God. And in verse 3, Seth was born in the likeness of Adam, right? Yeah. And Adam lived 930 years. And he had seemingly multiple children, right? Of course, we don't know about most of them. But on page 44, it had, probably like a disturbing but important question to ponder. And that is 44:2a, where it talks about where did these men get their wives?
Yeah.
Yeah. What did we find as the probable?
From the sons and daughters of
Brother and sister.
Yeah.
Brother and sister.
I know.
And I did read that the gene pool was so pure at that point, because of so few people, that it didn't become a problem with incestual things until around the time of Moses.
Mm-hmm. I have to believe that as much as that, that doesn't sit right with us at all, and I know that, right? I get that. But I have to also believe that there's not, when we think of those situations now, hold on just a second, I gotta holler at my kid. Hey Josh, you're being so loud. Take that back upstairs. Yes, I can hear you down here. Upstairs, upstairs, upstairs. Josh, thank you. My countenance will fall. Yeah, as much as that kind of wigs us out, I have to think, when we talk about incest now, when we talk about those kind of relationships now, it is an abuse of power. And I have to believe that in order for that it did not, excuse me just a second. Josh! No, I am teaching upstairs. Go. Okay, go upstairs faster. I love my children so much. I love you!
We love them too.
I know. Get out! No, I'm just kidding. Go ahead, Joyce, yes. Bring me back.
So, when we talk about living 900 years.
Yes.
So, how many of those years are childbearing? How many of those years are old age?
Yeah.
Is it possible that maybe if one child, say a son, was born when they were 80 and a daughter was born when they were 120, maybe they actually didn't know that person as a sister or a brother.
Mm-hmm.
That is true.
Yeah.
Maybe they were out on their own, so
Yes.
that it wasn't exactly like me marrying my brother was when
Yes.
it was 3 years younger than me.
Right.
You know.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's a good point too. I think a lot of the years were childbearing years, because I tend to think that's one of the reasons they lived so long. Because as people, because they stopped living this long, like after the flood, right?
He had to populate the earth also.
Right. Yes. And
That's
so
how it all
he
happened.
wanted them to have a lot of children, and so he gave them a lot of time to do it, which is kind of just one of like my basic thoughts. So I think that I think it's just one of those mysterious things that we have to wrestle with in terms of that's not at all what seems okay now. But there's a lot of things in the Old Testament from so long ago. I mean, look at all the laws that are like in Exodus and Leviticus that were like, no, we don't live that way now. That's just not the way it is. But obviously, when there were not other people, it's not like they didn't have other choices. It didn't even cross their mind. This is what you do, right? This is how this, so.
And as early as Seth and Cain, they maybe didn't have other choices.
Mm-hmm.
Think about that. Those Adam and Eve, if they were created as adults, the first child that was born as an infant was, their first child. And I mean, with Cain and Abel, and then Seth. I mean, you think about, well, there were probably some in between there, and it says there were other brothers and sisters or whatever, daughters, but there weren't any other choices to have a spouse.
Yeah.
And that was one way of populating the earth.
Right.
And again, the gene pool, if we think of it in our time, the gene pool is too conglomerated at this point for that to happen without horrible birth problems.
Yeah. Right.
But at that point, there really wasn't a problem with
Right. And it's just hard because it just seems wrong and gross to us. I mean, it just seems wrong.
But
Yeah.
I find it hard. find it that way in this time, but I can read that and that doesn't bother me at all.
Yeah, we just I think sometimes it's just hard to remove ourselves from what we know now and be like, well, it wasn't wrong. It didn't wrong and gross then, right? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And they were supposed to multiply. There wasn't another way.
Yeah. Let's see. Okay, so the chapter talks a lot about the earth being populated. It talks a lot about, how old people were. They lived this long and then they died and then they died. And it's important to remember that they died because of the wages of sin, because of chapter 3. Now they're living and they're dying, right? Because they're not able to live forever, kind of as what, I don't know. I always hate to say that God's plan got messed up. I don't really believe that, but, because they allowed evil into their life, because they allowed sin into their life, then death eventually is a result of sin. Although we have freedom from death in the blood of Jesus Christ. Amen. Thank goodness. And then we have this little chart. What page? What I put? Page 147. What was the chart? I made him a note. Page 147. Is that the? That's the overlap of the patriarchs, right?
I liked that.
Yeah, that was interesting. I'm not going to pull that out right now, but yeah, but it talked about how and then Enoch walked with God for 300 years. This is verses like 21 to 24 after his son was born, right? Yeah. The overlap.
I found it.
Yeah, did you? Yeah, that was interesting. Page 147 in the appendix.
I did enjoy it.
Oh yeah, I actually am going to pull that out because I wanted to talk about it actually. Is it in the appendix? I'm sorry, I should have already pulled it out.
Yes, it's in the appendix.
There it is. I found it already. Let's talk about Enoch and how we filled this out. So from the Genesis, for those of you who did this, had time to do this chart, from the Genesis 5:18 to 24. What I did was I divided up my Enoch stuff, and this is what I got from Genesis, and then I went a little bit farther down. I put this is what I got from Hebrews, and then I put a little bit farther down. This is what I got from Jude. So if you didn't do yours like that, that's where I'm coming from these things. So from the Genesis 5:18 to 24, what did we learn about Enoch?
Jared was his father.
His son of Jared. Yep.
Lived 365 years.
Yes.
He walked with God for 65 of those.
Yeah, for 300, right? Because he...
No, I think it's for only 65. If you look at it, they were 9. Hold on, I gotta find it.
Okay. Yeah, let's look.
All right, Enoch became
365.
He was 365 years old
When he died.
when he was taken.
When he died. What verse is that?
21. Start at 21.
21. Well,
All right,
23.
he lived 65 years and became a father.
Uh-huh.
Okay. I can't say it.
Yeah.
He walked with God. Oh, I'm sorry, 300 years after after he was the father.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is true.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. Here's the thing in 22, and I always ask myself the question, then Enoch walked with God. That could mean he didn't before, or it could mean then he continued to. Like, I don't know if we know for sure. I don't know if, did it point out anything like that or not, but I did write, yes, that he walked with God for 300 years. I took it kind of as the then he walked with God, but, so he had a son, Methuselah. Did somebody say Angie? A son, Methuselah, at 65, then walked with God for 300 years. And then, one day, what does it say? 24?
Take it out.
Yep, one day Enoch walked with God, and he was not. And God took him, for God took him.
But every other one it said that he died.
Right. Yeah, so there's this difference between how someone died when they walked with God like Enoch and how they died. It seemingly, at least for Enoch, there was a difference. The message said it this way: one day he was simply gone. He was just simply gone, and God took him. Yeah, so... what about in the Hebrews passage on something else? Yeah. What about the Hebrews passage on Enoch? That we looked up.
By faith he was taken up for pleasing God.
Yes. Yep. I wrote down, he was taken to heaven without dying. He was known as a person who pleased God. and that is it is impossible to please God without what? You guys pick up on that?
Hey,
It is impossible to please God without faith. And now go back a few minutes, what we're talking about, Cain and Abel. Did Cain please God with his offering?
no.
No. And so if we take the Hebrews and combine it with the fact that God didn't please God, what do we think we can probably deduce was the reason that Cain's offering didn't please God? It didn't come in faith, right? And think about when we put our offering in the plate, right? Do we do that out of habit? And sometimes we do, and so do I. But I mean, mine comes out of my checking account directly. I don't even do it. I don't even put it in the plate, right? Do we put it in the plate out of habit, or do we put it in the plate out of faith? Because I think this goes to what Joyce was saying. Because it's not like giving out of habit is a bad idea by any means, but there are times, at least, that we're called to make an offering in faith, and that can be money. And I think that a lot of times it is money, not because the ministry, not because God needs the money, but because money says so much about how we see ourselves in God, right? It's about how we value money, not about the dollars that spend, right? And our time. How do we offer it in faith? Go ahead, Joyce Wisely. Yeah.
I think of it as we're supposed to share. Now, sharing can come in a lot of different forms.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it could mean my donation to the food bank. It could mean making a mask for somebody.
Yep.
It could mean giving somebody a ride.
Yep.
To me, that would be what that would mean.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, for me, like with my No More Shame work, it doesn't bother me at all now, but like it was a process because I'm just being honest, I didn't want to talk about periods and pads and tampons all the time. It doesn't bother me at all now, but it was a process for me because it was a little bit of an offering in that, like, people don't really want to talk about this all the time. And my friend Bethany Turner, who writes, hey, it's launch day for my friend Bethany Turner, and if you guys like romantic comedies and you like to read, Bethany Turner, she's got a new book. Anyway, my friend Bethany, she talked about when she was writing, and she really felt like God was saying to her heart, somebody needs to talk about this. Why not you? And I kind of think the same with my No More Shame, but I think it would be fair to say, but putting my voice to that was kind of an offering for me, because I'm like, okay, why not me to talk about it, even though it's cleaner, it's safer to talk about something that people don't go like, why are you talking about that, right? And so, yeah, I guess for me, so I just share that because, like, it's not always, like, it needs to be about money sometimes, because it's not okay to be like, well, I just don't do the money thing, because money is important in our society, and how we value it is, like, and how we relate to it is important. But what do we bring in faith? I think that goes from the Hebrew. It's impossible to please God without faith. Your offering is not pleasing to God if it's not done in faith. And then how about from the Jude, verses 14 to 16? What do we learn about Enoch in the Jude passages?
He prophesied about ungodly men.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I put that he prophesied against false teachers and ungodly people, proclaimed a coming judgment, and verse 16 in Jude said, these people are... Oh, I wrote the whole verse down because I'm like, this is that kind of verse where I wrote it all down. Jude 16 says, these people are grumblers and complainers, living only to satisfy their desires. They brag loudly about themselves, and they flatter others to get what they want. So, there you go. Let's not do that. Yeah, and then we also looked at page 149 was that overlapping of the patriarchs' lives, which was, I'm not going to pull that out, but that was kind of interesting also. And then we get to the bottom of Genesis 5, and we start learning about who, which we're going to really focus on now for a little bit of time, coming up here soon. What familiar name is at the bottom of Genesis 5? Noah, that's right.
Noah.
And we looked at Noah, a little bit about descendants on page 45, number 3 at the genealogies when we were in Luke 3. Did you guys get that far this week? and how it helped us how we got from, yay, launch day, I know, how we got from Shem to God. I mean, not from Shem to God, from God to Shem. We talked, because God, yeah, I started on the opposite side and went this way, so Shem doesn't lead us to, well, I guess Shem could lead us to God. But we go from God to Shem, right, in that Luke 3, and Shem is a son of Noah, right?
Yes.
And all of these people in Seth's line are ultimately part of the line of Christ. Right. And then to kind of finish up, there was something on, this was just something that really stood out to me. Oh, page 43, this goes back to the faith thing, the heart that offers an offering and that sends up an offering. I had a note from the Enduring Word. I'm going to read this and look at page 43 to the last question, if you got that far. And the question was this, and I want to see what you guys think about it. Do people still approach God according to the way of Cain? Can you give some examples of people coming to God on their own terms in the church today? Will it work? Why or why not? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I put that we can't really I can't come to God on your own terms because we need to humble ourselves before God in obedience.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not really coming on your own terms.
Mm-hmm.
Those are His terms.
Right.
That,
mm-hmm. I made a note to myself about partial offerings. This is what it said in the Enduring Word, and see if this resonates with you at all. I wrote it down because it did to me. It said, there is no greater curse on the earth than empty, vain religion. Those who have a form of godliness, but deny the power of God. And then it had a little note, 2 Timothy 3:5. That's a bold statement. There is no greater curse on the earth than empty, vain religion. Those who have a form of godliness, but deny the power of God.
It's really brave, isn't it?
You know, it reminds me of what we studied in Galatians, for those of you who studied Galatians, in that there, we have a choice as good church people at what we're improving on. Are we getting better at church, or are we getting better at Jesus? And that's a question that we have to ask ourselves all the time. Are we getting better at church, or are we getting better at Jesus? Because the two paths, Cain, I don't know this for sure, but we could make an argument that Cain understood how to do church.
Mm-hmm.
Okay?
Yeah.
But Cain did not understand how to do Jesus, and this is pre-Jesus. Did you understand? But I know that's Old Testament. But I mean, you know what I mean, though. Like he knew what to do, but he didn't know how to be, or he chose not to learn how to be in relationship.
Mom and I had a conversation one time, and I found it it's one that kind of comes back to me off and on. And unfortunately, it happens to all of us, but it goes back to you going to church or you going to worship. It's
Right.
just going to church. It could be a crazy morning, and you had to get things for I'm using this as an example, for the fellowship cafe, you got up late, I just went to church that day.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But there are days that every day, actually, we should, but there is a difference in going to church and going to worship.
Yep.
And I think that, I don't know until we had that conversation how much I really thought about that, although I should have.
Well, and I would.
What happens many times, sometimes is it's a habit sometimes, and you go and you do these things, but are you really there for the right reason?
Yes, and I would argue, I think, or lift up this point of that is if church is your only outlet for worship, or your only the place where you're then you're probably not going there to worship. Like, I think church is one form, corporate worship is one form of worship for us to do in our lives. But I never really had moments of like sort of vulnerable worship in church. And my church relationship is so different because I work at church, and so I'll just confess that I have a different relationship. And so but in order to worship corporately, like when I'm not working, if that makes sense, I never really did that completely until I understood how to worship him privately. And so having private worship time enhances and it opens up my opportunity to worship him corporately. But I don't always feel worshipful in a corporate setting the way that I can like in a private setting. And so if you're depending upon corporate worship, it's kind of to me like depending on your school to teach your child everything they needs to know, and you're not doing anything at home, sort of thing. Well, they're only going to learn so much in a classroom setting if you don't reinforce those things at home, right? About any subject. And so if we're trying to have that hour a day, hour a week to be the thing that feeds us, we're not going to grow very fast.
But there is a lot of people that is true.
Sure. Yes.
That hour of worship or going to church, whichever it is, every week is the only worship.
And there's a lot of people that spend time in the Bible for head knowledge, and it never touches their heart. And we have to, always ask ourselves, what part of that is true for me?
Yeah.
What part of that is true for me, and how can I grow? Where is sin crouching at my door in my pride? Right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think we always have to be asking ourselves that question. So. We have a few minutes left, just a few, but what, either from my Facebook friends there or from you guys, what else, like things that stuck out to you in the chapter or questions?
Well, I had a question about Lamech.
Yes.
Hey,
Chloe.
Hi.
Hi, sweetheart. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good.
okay.
Lamech. Chloe's gonna answer the question on Lamech.
Someone just left.
Yeah, go ahead.
There were two of them, am I right?
2 Lamechs?
2 Lamechs, one of Cain and his wives, and then one of Seth.
I think I remember that now, actually.
And Seth's Lamech is the father of Noah.
Seth's Lamech is the father of Noah. Yes, this is Seth's line. Yes.
But in Genesis 4:23.
Yes.
4:24. It says if Cain is avenged sevenfold, then Lamech 77fold.
Uh-huh.
And then over in 5:31, it says that Lamech lived 777 years.
How did you find that? That's craziness.
Yes, I can't believe you found that.
You studied too good.
Whoa.
I do.
They're different Lamechs.
Yeah, they're different Lamechs. Yes.
But it's just that he said 77fold, and then this Lamech lived 777 years. And I noticed in one of the, I don't know, I didn't write it down, but there was a mention of it in one of the commentaries.
Okay.
So I'm not the only one that noticed
Right.
it, but, it was
I think it's fair to say you're the only one here that noticed it.
I just thought it was really weird.
That is
Well,
weird.
See, I'm a numbers person.
Yeah.
I'm a numbers person.
No, that's
so
cool.
I pick up on that stuff.
I didn't, that went right over my head. I didn't even notice that. Yeah. So that really wasn't a question. You were kind of just showing off. No, I'm just kidding.
No.
No,
My thing was, they're different Lamechs.
Yeah.
But they kind of followed through on each other.
Yeah,
Related.
I feel like it would have been so much simpler in the Bible if nobody had the same name, and also if the person kept the same name the whole time, then we wouldn't be so confused. But yeah, no, I do believe you're right. Those are Lamechs from 2 different lines. Yes.
2 different, yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it drives me crazy that they'll have like Enoch or Enosh.
Right.
And
I know
those
it,
yes.
one-letter differences in those families. It's great.
That my friend Latifa that I've talked about that used to live across the street that had the 7 children, and 6 boys and a girl, and she had 2 boys, and one was named, when I first met her, and and their names, you know, they're hard because they're not English names, and so they're not hard for them, they're hard for me because I speak English, right? And so I was trying to remember all their names and get them, and 2 boys in a row, one's Hatham and one's Hatham, and I'm like, why did you do that? Like, I'm like, Hatham and Hatham. Yeah, I'm like, no, that's too close. I can't. This American woman cannot do this. But you know, it's like anything else, though. After some time, I didn't get them confused anymore. I didn't have, you know, because I got to know them, and it's like, you know, when you know twins or something, for the most part, you can you recognize them because of their behavior or something more than, you know, because of what's inside. So, anything else? It's about time to wrap up. Lisa Wood says, Mary Ellen, this is to you. Here's what I learned, Mary Ellen. I won't live to be 700 anything years. I think that's good. I think we're all glad of that. Not because you won't live that long. I don't want to live that long. So
I'm ready.
I'm ready. All right.
I certainly don't want to be having children at how many hundreds of years old?
500 years old.
No, I'm 45. I'm done. Now. All right, let's pray together this morning. Holy Father, thank you so much for this class and for this group of people that studies through the week and then comes together, Lord, to share and to learn and to lift up thoughts and ideas and gleanings, and I just appreciate it so much, Lord. I learned so much in our time together, and it helps me also just when I talk through it, it just solidifies differently in my heart and in my brain, and it places these nuggets, these seeds of truth, Lord, that I know will continue to grow. And so I thank you for that. I thank you for your word. I thank you for this group to study with, Lord. I thank you for what you do in us and through us, Lord, because of our wanting to connect with you. And I just pray, God, that we can be people that continually desire to come to you in faith and offer you things in faith, Lord, and learn from you in faith. And God, I just appreciate so much your kindness and your patience with us as we grow. Lord, I just ask that you continue to guide us as we travel through this time of shelter in place. And for me, anyway, it feels like it's just lasting a long time, and there are days that I get weary of it, Lord, and I just lift that up to you and confess that to you. And I just pray, Lord, that you continue to help us be strong and to remember to focus on our blessings, and also, Lord, just to remember to dedicate time to you and connecting with you, Lord. And we just lift all of this in thanksgiving and praise in your name. Amen. All right, so I'm going to say goodbye to my Facebook group here.